The morning air clung cool against Aiden's skin as he stepped onto the narrow trail, the world around him still half asleep beneath a soft veil of mist. Behind him, the dirt road faded into quiet nothingness, swallowed by the towering evergreens that marked the forest's edge. He paused for one last look over his shoulder, not because he doubted the trip, but because some small part of him sensed that once he crossed into the trees, he would leave more behind than he expected. He tightened the straps of his backpack and breathed deeply, letting the scent of pine and damp moss settle into him. The forest greeted him with an almost reverent hush, a gentle stillness that felt welcoming and unsettling all at once. It was the kind of silence that didn't simply replace sound, it absorbed it. Aiden stepped forward, boots pressing into the thick bed of needles, and the world seemed to close around him like a door. In those first minutes, he focused on the rhythm of his strides, letting them carry him toward some quiet answer he hoped waited somewhere deeper in the wilderness. He had come here to escape the noise, the arguments, the unfinished plans, the hollow ache left by the breakup he still replayed late at night. Out here, he didn't have to pretend he was fine. The forest made no demands. It simply existed. Aiden's pace slowed as sunlight filtered through the canopy above, cutting soft golden shapes across the path. A squirrel darted up a cedar trunk, scattering bark. A distant bird called once, then fell quiet. Everything felt strangely expectant, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. He pulled out his map more out of habit than need. The trail, at least for now, was straightforward. He traced the dotted line leading toward the ridge, the place where he hoped to set camp before nightfall. It was supposed to be a simple hike, a reset. But a faint unease tugged at him, subtle, like a thread catching on fabric. Not fear, just awareness. The sense of being watched by ancient, indifferent eyes. Pushing the thought aside, Aiden continued, letting the forest guide him deeper. The path narrowed, winding between trees whose trunks twisted like old scars. Ferns brushed his legs. The air shifted cooler as the sun climbed higher, its warmth struggling to pierce the dense canopy. Still, the silence held. He reached a small clearing where a fallen log lay half-covered in moss. For a moment he sat, drinking water and listening to the faint rustle of leaves overhead. He felt almost peaceful, almost whole. Yet something in the stillness unsettled him, a tension he couldn't explain. The forest was beautiful, yes, but there was something beneath that beauty, something he could feel but not name. Aiden stood again, adjusting his pack, unaware that the first step he took from that clearing would mark the beginning of 30 days lost to the wilderness. The breeze shifted, stirring branches in a low whisper, and he moved on, deeper into the green silence, unaware of the eyes that followed or the tracks already forming far ahead of him. As the trail dipped into a darker stretch of woods, Aiden felt the temperature drop, a subtle shiver moving along his spine. He brushed it off and kept walking, unaware that the deeper he went, the more the silence thickened, becoming something heavier, almost watchful. His footsteps faded into the hush. Somewhere behind him, branches shifted, not loud, but enough to suggest he was not alone. He paused briefly, sensing the forest tightening around him. The deeper Aiden moved into the forest, the more the silence thickened, settling around him like a damp blanket. The stillness from earlier had felt peaceful, even calming, but now it carried a faint edge he couldn't quite name. It was as if the trees themselves were leaning in to listen, their branches poised in tight, breathless anticipation. Aiden adjusted the straps of his pack, trying to shake off the sensation, but it clung stubbornly to him, threading through every step he took. The air felt cooler, heavier, and the forest seemed to study him with quiet intent. He followed the trail as it curled beneath the tangled canopy, weaving between massive trunks scarred with age. The earlier rays of sunlight had dimmed to faint shards that barely touched the ground. Moss covered everything, stones, branches, fallen logs, like a thick green skin hiding whatever might linger beneath. Aiden tried focusing on the small sounds he expected to hear, the chatter of birds, the hum of insects, the rustle of creatures moving through brush. Instead he heard only the whisper of his own breathing, unervingly loud in the void. Not long after rounding a bend, he slowed. The trail ahead bore marks that didn't match anything he'd seen before. Several branches hung snapped at odd angles, as if twisted rather than broken cleanly. Below them, the soft earth revealed impressions he didn't recognize. Too large for deer, too irregular for human boots, too deep for anything he felt comfortable imagining. He crouched, fingertips brushing the edges of one print. The soil inside had been pressed down with deliberate force. Something heavy had passed through here, and recently. Aiden stood quickly, heart thudding once, hard. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees around him. They stared back in mute indifference, but a strange sensation crept up his spine, the feeling of being watched. He told himself it was nothing. The woods were full of strange marks, fallen animals, old storms, the chaos of nature. And yet, something about these impressions felt wrong. They carried intention, direction, purpose, as though whatever had made them knew exactly where it was going, and maybe exactly who was following. He resumed walking, but the unease trailed behind him like a shadow. Every now and then he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting a pair of eyes to catch the light. Nothing moved. No branches swayed without cause. No shapes shifted between trunks. Still, the feeling grew stronger, as though he had crossed an invisible threshold into a deeper, less forgiving part of the forest. Each step forward felt like a step away from something familiar and safe, into something older and less welcoming. A distant sound broke the silence, a low, drawn-out howl. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Aiden's breath froze in his chest. Wolves. He tried to steady himself. Wolves seldom attacked people. That's what the ranger at the trailhead had said last summer, when Aiden passed through the area on a shorter hike. Still, the howl carried an uncanny weight, echoing between the trees in a way that made the forest feel suddenly enormous and impossibly empty. When the howl faded, nothing replaced it. No answering calls. No natural noises returning. Just a deeper silence, settling like fog. He moved faster now, trying not to look like he was fleeing. The trail narrowed, forcing him between dense thickets that brushed painfully against his arms. The forest seemed to constrict around him, tightening as if trying to slow him down. Aiden swallowed hard, focusing on his breathing, grounding himself in the steady rhythm of steps. He told himself he was imagining things, that he was just on edge from the howl. But each time he inhaled, he sensed something just out of reach, some faint shift in the air, some soft crunch that didn't quite match his footfalls. Eventually he reached a sloping section of trail where scattered stones made walking tricky. As he stepped carefully over them, his boot nudged something pale jutting from the dirt. He bent down and picked it up, a long piece of torn fabric, frayed at the edges and stained with something dark. The cloth fluttered weakly in his shaking hand. Aiden's pulse spiked. Someone had been here before him. Recently. And something had gone very wrong. He tucked the fabric into his pocket, exhaling shakily. Whatever had happened along this trail wasn't an accident. The forest was hiding a story, and he was walking straight into it. Without realizing, Aiden slowed again, scanning the trees for movement. The silence pressed harder. The shadows sharpened. And somewhere far ahead, something unseen waited for him to come closer, step by step. The fabric Aiden had found weighed heavily in his pocket as he continued along the narrowing trail, its frayed edges brushing against his fingers whenever he adjusted his pack. The discovery clung to his thoughts like a burr, refusing to loosen. Someone else had walked this path, someone who had not returned for it. The forest seemed almost to acknowledge this realization, its silence shifting from watchful to something more intent, as though it were waiting for his next move. The marks on the trail, the howls in the distance, the strange impressions in the soil, they all began to knit into a pattern he didn't yet understand. The day had slipped by faster than he expected. When he finally looked up through the canopy, he saw the light thinning, softening into the faint gold that preceded dusk. The sky above was barely visible, framed by the tall pines that crowded overhead like a cathedral of darkened beams. Aiden checked his watch, surprised to see how far the afternoon had fallen. He should have reached the ridge by now. The map had indicated a clear, uncomplicated route, yet the turns he had taken no longer lined up with what he remembered. He slowed, examining the trees around him with careful, uncertain eyes. He pulled the map from his pocket, unfolding it across his palm. The paper felt wrong somehow, as though the lines no longer pointed anywhere precise. The trail on the map ran straight, but the one before him curved sharply to the right. He frowned, turning in a slow circle. Even the clearing behind him looked unfamiliar, as though something had shifted the moment his back was turned. His compass offered no comfort. Its needle wavered, trembling before spinning lazily in a way that made no sense. Aiden tapped it, then shook it, but the needle only wobbled harder, pointing nowhere at all. A subtle dread curled in his stomach. He wasn't lost. He couldn't be. Not here, not on a trail meant for casual hikers. Yet the forest no longer felt like a place with rules. Its paths seemed to fold into each other, looping like threads drawn tight by unseen hands. He tried retracing his steps, but after only a few minutes, he realized he couldn't find the rock he had stepped over or the broken branch he had brushed aside earlier. Each direction looked the same, and the growing darkness made it harder to distinguish one shadow from another. A faint sound stirred behind him. He froze, breath catching in his throat. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunch, as though a foot had pressed down on dry needles. He turned quickly, eyes scanning the dim shapes between the trees. Nothing moved. Silence pressed in again, thicker than before. "Hello," he called, his voice cracking slightly. It echoed weakly, swallowed almost immediately by the dense, unmoving forest. No response came. The air felt charged, like the atmosphere before a storm. Aiden could sense something there, just beyond sight, retreating when he looked and advancing when he turned away. He forced himself to keep walking, hoping to find a landmark or a break in the trees that would realign his sense of direction. But dusk deepened rapidly, turning the shadows into solid walls of gray. The temperature dropped, a cold that seeped beneath his clothes and settled against his skin. His breathing grew quicker, clouding faintly in the dimming light. Every step felt heavier than the last. He no longer walked with the confidence of a hiker. He moved with the caution of prey, aware that it was being followed. The earlier unease had sharpened into something more visceral, more immediate. When the path abruptly ended at a cluster of towering pines he didn't recognize, Aiden stopped. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, drowning out the suffocating quiet. He spun around, realizing with a stab of panic that he couldn't tell where he'd entered this small patch of forest. All the trees looked identical, forming a ring that pressed inward. He reached out, touching the rough bark of a trunk, grounding himself. He needed to think. He needed shelter, warmth, and enough calm to face the night without losing himself completely to fear. The forest was closing in, and he needed to stay steady. He found a fallen tree nearby, its roots torn from the soil as though ripped up by some unseen force. The hollow beneath its trunk offered partial shelter. He crawled inside, pulling his jacket tight, listening to the distant low wind rolling through the branches. But beneath that wind, another sound lingered, soft, almost rhythmic, like steps pacing somewhere beyond the line of trees. His breath shook. The forest was no longer just quiet, it was attentive, watchful. The last sliver of light faded from the sky, and darkness settled fully, swallowing shapes, trails, and certainty alike. Aiden curled deeper into the shelter as a new howl, closer than before, rose through the dusk. The sound stretched long and cold, threading through the trees like a warning. His heart hammered. He had thought he was coming here to escape. Now, he wasn't sure he would make it out at all. And somewhere in the shifting dark, the forest seemed to whisper that his real ordeal was only beginning. The first 24 hours after Liam's disappearance stretched into something warped and unbearable. Time that moved, but only in circles. Sarah found herself retracing the same few yards of the trail, scanning the ground until her eyes burned. She kept expecting him to appear between the trees, half smiling, apologizing for wandering off. But the forest stayed silent, offering nothing but the soft whip of wind through pine needles. At first, the search felt organized, simple, even. She called out his name, waited, listened. She checked the ridge where he'd last stood, walked the loop he always used to take, even checked the river bend they'd stopped at earlier in the day. But as hours crept into another night, something inside her began to change. The confidence she'd clung to, he's nearby, it's just a wrong turn, bled into something colder. Fear. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, efficient kind that sinks into the stomach and refuses to leave. Liam. Her voice cracked as she climbed a boulder slick with evening dew. Liam, answer me. The echo that returned was thin, swallowed almost instantly by the trees. She pressed her hand to her forehead, trying to stop it from spinning. He wouldn't just leave the trail. He was meticulous, borderline obsessive, about staying oriented. Something was wrong. She knew it, even if she tried not to say it. By the second day, volunteers had begun arriving. Locals, hikers, a retired ranger who drove 3 hours just to help. But they weren't characters in her life yet, not really. They stayed on the edges, faces passing through fog, voices blending with the static of radios. Sarah felt detached from them, like she was floating a yard above her own body. Most of her hours were spent alone, walking sections of the trail while the search team organized grids. She kept replaying their last conversation. Short, ordinary, nothing dramatic. Liam had paused near a cluster of leaning firs, tying the loose strap on his pack. "I'll catch up," he'd said, waving her ahead. She'd smiled. "Don't take 20 minutes doing it." "I won't. Promise." A promise now swallowed in the thick silence of the woods. As the days stacked like heavy stones, the reality of his absence began pressing down with its full weight. Sarah found herself waking in the tent each morning to a moment of complete blankness. No memory, no grief, followed a heartbeat later by the crushing reminder. He was gone. His water bottle still sat beside her pack. His favorite trail mix was untouched. Every small belonging left behind felt like a clue, though none of them led anywhere. Even the forest seemed to shift around her. The colors felt harsher. The sounds carried differently. Sometimes, while walking search paths with volunteers, she caught movement in the corner of her eye, shadows slipping between branches. It always vanished when she turned her head. It didn't feel like she was alone out here. But when she mentioned it, the others reassured her it was just stress. Exhaustion. The mind playing tricks. Maybe they were right. Maybe. But by the 5th day, Sarah stopped believing the disappearance was accidental. Something, though she couldn't name it, couldn't even describe it, felt wrong. Wrong in a way that lived beneath language. She didn't share that thought with anyone. Not yet. Instead, she kept moving. Calling. Searching. Refusing to leave the woods even when others urged rest. Late one afternoon, as the light thinned into amber and the air cooled, she spotted something near a fallen cedar, a partial footprint in soft soil. Wide. Distinct. Not quite human. A tremor shot through her. Not fear. Not relief. Something stranger. The search coordinator approached from behind her. "Sarah? You okay?" She didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. She kept staring at the print, the edges blurred but unmistakable enough to send a chill crawling up her spine. Because Liam hadn't been wearing boots with that tread. And whatever left that mark, it wasn't walking alone. Sarah exhaled slowly, the air catching in her throat. The forest suddenly felt alive, watching her, listening. And for the first time, she wondered if Liam's disappearance was only the beginning of something far more unsettling. Hope didn't return all at once. It arrived the way dawn does, slow, cautious, barely noticeable until you realized the dark had shifted. For Sarah, that shift came the morning after she found the strange footprint near the fallen cedar. She hadn't slept. Her mind replayed the shape of the print in endless loops. It wasn't Liam's. It wasn't any hiker's. Yet something about it tugged at her instincts, as if the forest were nudging her toward something she'd overlooked. By sunrise, she was already moving, stepping over slick roots and ducking beneath branches heavy with dew. She didn't know what she was searching for exactly, but she felt pulled, guided by a quiet urgency she couldn't explain. The air was sharp, almost metallic. The woods felt different too, though she couldn't say why. Maybe it was the light, thinner and more forgiving after days of oppressive gloom. Maybe it was her own desperation turning into something else. Maybe it was simply time. A radio crackled behind her. One of the search volunteers, Mark, a quiet man with steady eyes, approached with cautious steps. "Sarah," he said softly, "you should stay close to the group today." She shook her head. "I can't. Not today. There's something out here. Something I need to follow." He frowned. "We found nothing yesterday. Trails are cold. Weather's shifting. Wandering alone. I won't go far, she lied. Mark hesitated, then nodded once. Yell if you need us. Any sign, anything at all. She appreciated the restraint in his voice, the way he didn't talk to her like she was breaking. But she didn't want to explain the truth. She felt Liam's presence in the woods, faint but real, like a pulse beneath the earth. She reached the cedar again near midday. The strange footprint had softened, edges blurring under the night's moisture. But something new caught her eye, a broken branch not far from the impression. At first it seemed random. But then she noticed the tear in the bark, the fresh fibers still pale and damp. Someone had passed through recently. Or something. Heart beginning to quicken, Sarah followed the faint disturbance in the undergrowth. It wasn't a trail, more like a suggestion of one. A patch of pressed ferns. A scrape on a mossy stone. A thread of fabric caught on a bramble, sun-faded but unmistakably blue. Liam's jacket was blue. Her breath hitched. Oh my God, Liam. She clutched the tiny thread, barely half an inch long, but it felt like a lifeline. After days of nothing, this fragment felt impossibly precious. Her knees weakened and she steadied herself against the trunk of a spruce. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't the forest tricking her. This was him. Proof of him. Her pulse thundered with a mix of relief and terror. If he had been here, then where had he gone next? And why hadn't he called out? She moved forward, more urgently now, following the slight disturbances the way one follows a whisper. The forest narrowed, funneling her toward a darker pocket of trees. She hesitated at the threshold. Something about the place felt wrong, quiet in a way that wasn't natural. Still, she stepped in. The canopy thickened above her, filtering the light into thin, pale blades. The air smelled wild, colder. She noticed more signs ahead, disturbed soil, scattered pine needles, a faint path leading deeper. Her heart lifted and twisted at once, hope braided tightly with dread. She crouched, touching the ground lightly. Liam, please be close. A snap echoed behind her, quick, soft, intentional. She spun around, heart slamming into her ribs. Nothing. Not a movement. Not a shadow. But she was certain something had been there. Something watching. Her skin prickled, but she didn't retreat. Because for the first time since the nightmare began, she had a direction. A lead. A flicker of hope. The discovery of the strange footprint stayed with Sarah all night. Not as comfort, but as a question that gnawed at the walls of her mind. Still, when dawn arrived, pale and bruised over the horizon, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself in days. Movement inside her chest. A tiny stirring. Not certainty, not even belief. Just the possibility of hope. She stepped out of her tent before the others woke, breathing in the cold air that pooled low between the trees. Every sound felt sharper in the early light. The cracking limbs, the rustle of distant birds, the low hum of wind dragging itself through the valley. The forest was changing, or maybe she was. After days of dead ends, the woods suddenly felt responsive. As if something had shifted overnight. She moved silently toward the spot where she'd found the footprint, feeling pulled by an instinct she couldn't reason through. A soft memory of Liam's laugh flickered in her mind, the way he always teased her for overthinking everything. Maybe now she was underthinking, moving on impulse alone. Either way, she couldn't stop. When she reached the fallen cedar, she saw it immediately, something she had missed before. A faint drag in the soil, barely a few inches wide, leading away from the tree. It wasn't a clean trail, more like something, or someone, had stumbled or crawled. Her breath quickened. Liam, she whispered. The name felt fragile in her mouth. She followed the drag mark cautiously, her steps careful, heart punching against her ribs. The forest around her darkened as the sun dipped behind early clouds, casting long shadows that made every movement look deceptive. The branches overhead formed a heavy ceiling, muffling the wind and swallowing sound. But she kept going. Soon she found more, a smudge of dirt on bark at shoulder height, then a pine branch snapped clean at the midpoint. Not the random break of storm damage, but the sharp, intentional fracture of someone pushing through in desperation. Her pulse surged. These weren't random signs. They weren't accidents. Someone had been struggling through here, fighting against the thicket. And Liam had been exhausted even before he disappeared. As she followed the faint trail deeper, her radio hissed sharply at her belt. "Sarah, check in," a voice called, Mark's calm, sturdy tone. She pressed the button but kept her eyes ahead. "I'm all right. I found something. I need to follow it." A pause. Then, "Wait for us. Don't move too far alone." But she released the button before he finished. She didn't have time for warnings. If Liam was hurt, every minute mattered. Her foot caught on a root and she stumbled forward, catching herself on her hands. Something glinted near the base of a nearby spruce. At first she thought it was dew, but when she reached for it her fingers closed around something cold and metallic. Her throat tightened. Liam's compass. She recognized the scratches across the casing, the dent near the hinge from when he dropped it years ago on a cliffside trail. She held it to her chest, eyes stinging, breath shaking out in broken threads. He had been here. Recently. Close enough to drop something he never lost. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something powerful and undeniable pierce through the fear. Hope. Sharp, sudden, electric. But before she could call it in, a sound drifted through the trees. Not a bird. Not the wind. A low, distant howl. She froze. It wasn't human. It wasn't far. And it wasn't alone. The hairs on her arms lifted as another howl joined it, closer, layered, circling. She swallowed hard, clutching the compass as if it were the only real thing left in the world. If wolves were this close, then so was Liam. Whether that meant safety or danger, Sarah didn't yet know. The howl lingered long after the forest fell silent again, echoing through Sarah's bones as if the sound had burrowed beneath her skin. She stood perfectly still, gripping Liam's compass so tightly the metal edges pressed into her palm. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest scent of earth and musk, wild, unmistakable. The wolves were close. Closer than she was ready for. But turning back wasn't an option. Not anymore. Not with proof of Liam's presence in her hand. She steadied her breathing, lifting her head to scan the tree-line. The woods looked unchanged, calm, indifferent, but she could feel movement just beyond sight. Branches rustled without wind. The air trembled in quiet pulses. The forest wasn't empty. Somewhere ahead, Liam had traveled through this same space. Injured, disoriented, or running from something she still didn't understand. And now she was on his trail. Fear nipped at her heels, but something stronger pushed against it, rising inside her like a tide she couldn't fight. Resolve. She took one step forward, then another. Her radio crackled again, louder this time, snapping the tension. "Sarah, come in. Please respond." Mark's voice was sharper now. She hesitated, thumb hovering over the button. If she answered, they would come for her, pull her back, slow her down, maybe stop her completely. If she didn't, she took a shaky breath and pressed the button anyway. "I'm here." "Where are you?" She glanced at her surroundings, the twisted roots, the narrow corridor of trees, the faint drag marks that led onward like a broken thread. "Following a lead." What kind of lead? Her silence gave him the answer he feared. "Sarah, listen to me. If wolves are active in that section, you shouldn't." She released the button, cutting the voice off mid-sentence. Not out of disrespect, but because hearing caution right now felt like stepping into quicksand. She couldn't let herself sink. The forest waited. She moved. The deeper she went, the more the landscape shifted into a harsher, older world. Steeper slopes, denser underbrush, and a strange hush that made her feel like she was trespassing into something ancient. Every sound mattered here. Every snapped twig could be a warning or a clue. She found another broken pine limb, angled downward as if something heavy had leaned against it. A few yards later, she spotted a partial handprint smeared in mud along a boulder's edge. Her breath caught. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. Liam had been fighting to stay upright. Something was driving him. Or chasing him. A shiver crawled down her spine. A distant growl rolled through the trees, not a howl this time, but a low, territorial sound that vibrated in the air. Sarah froze, pulse pounding against her throat. Her imagination painted images she didn't want to see. Liam stumbling, bleeding, alone while shadows tracked his every step. But fear alone wouldn't save him. She remembered his voice in her memory, soft but steady. Fear tells you what's at stake, Sarah. Resolve tells you what to do next. She tightened her grip on the compass. Resolve. She crossed the narrow ridge, heart steadying with each step. The forest opened slightly as she reached a small clearing. Sunlight broke through, catching on something near the base of a stump. She rushed toward it, breath sharp with hope. A strip of fabric. Blue. Torn. Her chest tightened painfully. This was his jacket. She was sure of it now, not just instinct but proof. She lifted the fabric carefully, noticing dried blood along the torn edge. Not a lot, but enough. Enough to know he was wounded. Enough to know he kept moving anyway. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she folded the fabric gently and slipped it into her pocket. Resolve over fear. She straightened, scanning the trees ahead. Somewhere beyond this clearing, something waited. Answers, danger, and the next step in the forest's hidden truth. And she stepped toward it, unaware that the next chapter would force her deeper into the wood's darkest heart. Sarah stepped out of the clearing, gripping the torn blue fabric in her pocket like a fragile pulse. The forest ahead was darker, thicker, pressed tight with undergrowth. She could feel eyes on her, the woods observing, measuring, waiting. The air held a strange tension, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. But she kept walking. With every step, the quiet grew heavier, almost unnatural. Even the birds had gone silent. She glanced back once, half expecting to see shadows emerging behind her, but nothing moved except the slight sway of branches in the wind. She focused forward. Liam had come this way. The faint signs on the earth told her that much. But now, something else hung in the air, a shift in the forest's energy that felt both threatening and alert. It wasn't just wolves out here. She felt it before she heard it. A twig snapped behind her. Her body stiffened. Slowly, she turned. A figure stood between two towering firs, motionless, half hidden by shadow. For a heartbeat, her mind supplied the only thing it wanted to believe. Liam. But the shape was wrong, broader shoulders, heavier build. And as the figure stepped into a sliver of filtered light, she exhaled sharply. It wasn't Liam. It wasn't a wolf. It was a man. He raised both hands slowly, palms outward, in a gesture meant to calm. "Hey," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." He wore forest green hiking clothes, stained with dirt and weather, and a pack that looked worn from weeks on the trail. His beard was overgrown, his dark hair tangled, eyes sunken with fatigue, but clear. Observant. He looked like someone who lived more in wilderness than out of it. Sarah didn't lower her guard. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice tight. The man gave a slow nod. "Name's Elias. I've been tracking something through these woods. Heard the search teams the last few days but stayed back." She frowned. "Tracking what?" His gaze shifted briefly toward the deeper forest. "Wolves." The word hit her harder than she expected. He continued, stepping no closer. "There's a pack moving strangely, too close to human trails, too restless. They're spooked by something. I wanted to understand why." Sarah felt a tremor crawl up her spine. "You've seen them?" Elias studied her carefully, as if weighing how much she could handle. "I've heard them. I'm guessing you have too." A low hum of fear worked its way under her ribs. She nodded. He exhaled slowly. "Something's got them stirred up. They're roaming more. Scavenging. Tracking injuries." Her breath caught. "Injuries?" He hesitated. "Human injuries." Sarah's heart hammered. "You mean Liam?" Recognition flickered in his eyes. "The missing hiker." "Yes." "I think the pack crossed his path. maybe more than once. A wave of nausea rolled through her. She pressed a hand to a tree to steady herself. Is he alive? Elias didn't answer immediately. His silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally. I think someone survived out here. Someone hurt, moving slow, trying to stay ahead of animals that usually don't track humans unless. He stopped himself. Unless what? She demanded. Elias looked at her with a mixture of empathy and warning. Unless they smell blood. Sarah closed her eyes, gripping the tree bark until splinters bit her palm. She wanted to break. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened. Then help me find him. Elias considered her for a long, silent moment. Then he slung his pack more securely over his shoulder. All right. But we move carefully. The pack is close. He stepped past her, pointing toward a narrow stretch of trees. Your hiker went this way. Her pulse surged. For the first time, she wasn't alone. But as she followed him into the tightening corridor of forest, she sensed something else, something neither of them yet understood, waiting deeper within the trees. The forest grew narrower as Sarah followed Elias, its branches knitting so tightly overhead that the afternoon light filtered through in thin, trembling strands. Each step felt heavier than the last. She kept hearing Liam's name echoing in her mind, now tangled with Elias's warnings about wolves and blood. The idea that Liam was still moving through these woods, hurt and alone, twisted like a knife beneath her ribs. Elias slowed, lifting a hand to signal silence. She stopped beside him, breath shallow, eyes fixed on the shadows ahead. Hear that? He whispered. At first she heard nothing but the soft pulse of wind through needles. Then, faint, almost swallowed, came the sound. A shuffle. A drag. A strained, uneven footfall moving somewhere through the thick undergrowth. Her heart shot upward. That's him, she whispered, voice trembling. But Elias didn't move. His eyes narrowed, scanning. Maybe. The uncertainty gutted her. She stepped forward instinctively, but Elias caught her arm, not rough, but firm. Don't rush in. Wolves imitate patterns sometimes. Following prey. Tracking movement. She swallowed hard. Wolves don't walk like people. A faint, strained cry echoed through the trees. Her knees nearly buckled. Liam. That has to be him. Elias's grip tightened. Sarah. Stop. Listen. The cry came again. But something about it made her freeze. The sound wavered strangely, rising too sharply at the end, as if bouncing off the trees at the wrong angle. It lacked the human breath, the human weight she knew so well. Her skin crawled. Elias whispered, That's mimicry. Her breath hitched. Wolves can't. Not wolves. He scanned the trees again. Echo tricks. Gaps in terrain that twist sound. These woods distort everything. But Sarah wasn't convinced. The cry, illusion or not, pulled at something deep inside her. It sounded like pain. Like someone struggling not to fall apart. Like Liam. She slipped out of Elias's grasp and moved forward a few steps before stopping. The forest in front of her shifted subtly, the shadows bending with the breeze. A flicker of movement darted between the trees, too fast, too quiet, too thin to identify. Her heart hammered wildly. Something's there, she whispered. Elias stepped beside her. I know. But that doesn't mean it's him. Another sound cut through the air, a rustle, a sharp crack, and then what unmistakably sounded like a human gasp. Sarah felt tears rise, hot and sudden. I'm going to him. Elias shook his head. Sarah, don't. But she was already pushing forward, driven by something beyond fear, beyond reason. She broke through a veil of low branches, thorns scraping her arms as she stumbled into a small clearing. And froze. A figure crouched near the far edge, back hunched, shoulders rising and falling in shallow, desperate breaths. Their clothes were torn, mud-caked, the hair matted. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Every part of her wanted to run to him, to collapse and finally let relief consume her. Liam, she whispered. The figure jerked at the sound. Slowly, too slowly, it turned. Sarah's hope fractured. It wasn't Liam. It wasn't even fully visible yet, its face shadowed, features indistinct, movements wrong. Human shape, but not human stillness. Its limbs twitched as if adjusting to being seen. The head tilted in a stiff, unnatural angle, and Sarah stepped back instinctively. Elias appeared beside her, breath harsh. "Sarah!" Behind me. She shook her head, breath quivering. What is it?" Elias didn't answer. His body tensed, one hand lowering toward a knife at his belt. Whatever you thought you heard, whatever was calling, wasn't Liam. The figure twitched again, then slipped backward into the shadows with eerie, fluid speed, gone almost before Sarah registered the movement. Her pulse roared in her ears. The forest fell silent. And in that silence, Sarah realized something far more terrifying than wolves was stalking these woods. Something that had found her before she found Liam. She took one trembling step back as Elias exhaled sharply. The air still hummed with the echo of the encounter, real or imagined, as I moved deeper into the thinning forest. Every branch I brushed felt like it might recoil, every whisper of wind like it hid a message I couldn't yet decipher. The tracks I'd found earlier cut a trembling path through the soil, impossibly precise, as if pressed by something that weighed nothing at all. Still, they were the first tangible sign since everything had begun collapsing around me, and following them felt less like a choice and more like instinct pulling me forward. Shadows stretched long and sharp as dusk crept in, hinting at shapes that didn't quite belong. More than once I felt watched, but turning yielded only empty space. The farther I went, the colder the silence grew, thick, warning, deliberate. And then, just ahead, the tracks abruptly stopped, as if whatever made them had simply lifted away. I wasn't alone. For a heartbeat I stood frozen before the sudden end of the trail, but then the forest shifted, subtle, deliberate, and something else caught my eye. Just beyond the place where the strange prints vanished, a second set of tracks curved through the underbrush. These were clearer, heavier, unmistakably real. Wolf tracks, deep and fresh, leading away from the silent clearing. Relief flickered through me, thin but welcome. Whatever had been stalking me might have left, but something earthly had passed through moments before, and following it felt almost like finding a thread back to the world I knew. The pawprints moved with purpose, weaving between blackened roots and silvered ferns, guiding me toward higher ground. Each step steadied my breath. Wolves knew this forest. They survived it. If they were headed somewhere, maybe that somewhere could shelter me too. But as I rounded a mossy ridge, the tracks halted beside a narrow ravine, disturbed, scattered, as if a struggle had taken place. And something still waited below. Even after I scrambled out of the ravine, lungs burning and hands shaking, the forest refused to release its grip on me. Every shadow felt alive, every rustle behind me a reminder of how close I'd come to disappearing for good. The scattered wolf tracks replayed in my mind, signs of a struggle I hadn't witnessed yet somehow felt complicit in, as if the woods expected me to understand a message I kept failing to read. I found a fallen log and sat, trying to steady my thoughts, but the silence pressed in with the weight of a confession. I wasn't just tired. I was changed. The woods had carved something out of me and left the hollow space echoing with questions I didn't dare speak aloud. Still, as unsettling as it was, one truth pulsed through the fear. Whatever lingered out here wasn't finished with me yet. And I wasn't finished with it. By the time I staggered toward the thinning trees, the sky had begun to pale, washing the forest in a tired, colorless dawn. Light should have comforted me, but instead it exposed everything I'd been trying not to see. The scratches along my arms, the trembling in my legs, the lingering sense that something had followed me out of the dark. Each step forward felt like stepping between two worlds, one pulling me back, one uncertainly waiting ahead. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting movement, expecting eyes. The woods looked still, yet I knew better. The silence was too intentional, like a held breath. Even the wind seemed to hesitate as I crossed the last shadowed ridge. When the first distant hum of rescue searchers reached me, relief didn't come. Because the moment I stepped into the clearing, my instincts whispered that the danger wasn't behind me anymore. It was coming with me.